Introduction. Really great to be here. Really great to be back at Madison. This is my alma mater, so it's been about, I don't know, it's been a long time since I've been in this building, but really great to be here again. So as Professor Banerjee mentioned, much of this talk is going to be based on the book that just came out. This is supposed to work. Okay. I think we have a little bit of a jam here. Let's see if I'm unable to establish secure connection. Okay.
This just tells us how good the talk is going to be.
Well, this is it's trying to establish a connection to Zoom, which I have no interest in Zooming. Okay, there we go. So there's a flyer that makes that available to you. The material for this presentation is largely based on the last several chapters of the book. So it's a general history of Christians in South Asia, but the last few chapters deal with 20th century, and the very last chapter is contemporary anti-Christian violence, the surge in anti-Christian violence in India, and the growth of Pentecostalism. So that's the material I'll be drawing from today. So over the last several years, I've been moving in the material on Citizenship Studies. And these are some of the texts that have been very informative for me over the years about reflecting on citizenship. Partha Chatterjee's The Politics of the Governed, and more recently, a book by Jason Keith Fernandez discusses this distinction between civil society, which is a participatory space where people actually have a voice in how decisions are made, and political society, where the poor are relegated to, despite having de jure citizenship. They are sent into this other space where they really don't have, in practice, real rights. Jason Keith Fernandez takes that framework and applies it to Goan Catholics who are trying to find a space within Goan society and the nation. He does some very interesting things with that distinction between civil society and political society. What I like about these two books, Sumathi Ramaswamy's Passions of the Tongue and Bailey's Origins of Nationality, is that they really bring regional culture into this discussion of national belonging. And they put a real primacy on regional cultural formations and the need to access the national through the gateway of the regional. Whether that's through the use of mother tongue, the Tamil devotion to one's mother tongue, Tamil in the case of Ramaswamy's study, or to these regional patrias that Bailey talks about. So when you put all of this together, you have this notion of the ideal citizen subject. Who is the ideal citizen subject? And if you gestalt this material together, this becomes the ideal citizen subject, the modern upper caste Hindu male who embodies the virtues of a regional culture and grounds his claim to cultural hegemony in a pure classical heritage. And so the way to access national belonging, the way to access national citizenship is to emulate that ideal citizen subject. And that becomes the basis of a number of studies, including my own, that really talk about the attempts of Christians to belong by accessing citizenship through this process of emulation. But my argument today, I guess I don't need an argument, I can just tell you, talk about it. You know how formal I was supposed to be, but it sounds like this is pretty chill. But my argument is that once again, wanting to establish a secure Zoom connection, funny things, Dalit Christians and Pentecostals decenter the ideal citizen subject by offering alternative sites of meaning, identity, and belonging. And it's in that act of decentering that it triggers violence. So acts of decentering triggers acts of violence, and this is the explanatory framework that I'm presenting to explain the surge in anti-Christian violence over the past several years in India. And I'll try to unpack that in due course. So before we talk about decentering, I want to say some things about centering. the earlier expressions of Christianity during the era of Indian nationalism were very fixated on emulating the ideal citizen subject, and they did so by trying to embrace a regional expression of that ideal citizen. So my first book was about Christians in the Madras Presidency and their attempt to overcome a sense of marginality by trying to look more Hindu. So they espoused projects like rethinking Christianity in India, refashioning Christian expression so that it embraced Hindu Brahminical Sanskritic idiom and practices. And so this was the Madras Project. There has been some very interesting work done by Deepra Dandekar on Maratha Protestants who were largely Brahmin converts to Christianity. And they produced a literary culture in Maharashtra that was that produced a print culture of a very high order. Newspapers, biographies, tracts, and it was a very visible, vocal Christian Marathi presence that tried to harmonize Brahmin, Christian, and Protestant identity. Jason Keith Fernandez does a similar thing by talking about Goan Catholics and their attempts to prove that they are Brahmins. And they did so by emphasizing the Konkani language and the relationship of that language to Sanskrit. And that became their project. They drew upon Orientalist scholarship to make that case. But the Goan elite Catholics tried to show that they shared this common heritage with Saraswat Brahmins of Goa. And you see similar things going on with the Syrian Christians and Nambudiri Brahmins of Kerala, Bengali Christians of Dr. Banerjee's work and their access into the Bhadrlok domains of West Bengal. All of this shows that this was an attempt to center Christianity, to access Indian nationhood through the gateway of these regional expressions of Brahminitude. Two observations about this project. First, it was not a project that succeeded. Despite the attempts to emulate, despite the attempts to become Brahmin or claim Brahmin heritage or Indianized Christianity, it kind of disappeared like a puff of smoke after independence. And that vibrant expression of print culture really did not continue into the 1950s and 60s. And the other observation I would make is that it was kind of subsumed by Indian nationalism. It got marginalized very quickly by Brahmin reform movements in various parts of India that marginalized the Christian voice. But there was something that actually pushed this to the sidelines even more radically, and that was mass conversions to Christianity from social classes that were very far removed from Sanskritic heritage. And so these are mass conversions among Dalits in various parts of India, not simply Tamil and Telugu country, but also in Punjab and central India. There were mass conversion movements among marginal classes of people. And this is the moment of decentering. This is the beginning of the decentering work that I'm going to talk about. It follows a type of trajectory. I'm going to begin by talking about mass movements in the 20th century a little bit, but the end game is this trajectory of Dalit Christians into Pentecostalism. And this new sense of belonging that many Dalits are finding in Pentecostal movements. And it's what I call affective citizenship. It's a space which is highly emotional, highly affective, that is cultivating a sense of belonging among marginal classes of people, and claims to succeed where other Christian traditions have not in overcoming caste distinctions. And so we can look at that more carefully. But this is the identity trajectory that I want to draw your attention to. You have the mass conversions of the late 19th and early 20th century. there is this phase of identity ambiguity or identity limbo that follows these mass conversions. And what's interesting about this moment in Dalit Christian formation is that it is very frustrating for missionaries, for foreign missionaries, to see that it's very difficult to constitute a proper Christian subject out of a mass convert. These are largely uneducated, illiterate folk, and there's this constant question of the missionaries, are they really Christian? Are they really Christian? So they perform these tests of sincerity. Can you recite the Lord's Prayer? Can you recite the catechisms? And if they are able to pass a certain litmus test, they're able to undergo baptism. But how do you do that with thousands of people? You got to keep the production line going. And there's a little bit of dilemma for quality control from the missionary standpoint. You have mass production, but what if there's no quality control? So you've got this phase of identity limbo. Gradually, you have the production of Dalit Christian theology in the 1950s and 1960s that consolidates a Dalit identity, which is also Christian. And then you have this moment of movement into Pentecostalism. So that's the trajectory I'm describing in those last sections of my book. And it's not an immediate trajectory, but we'll take a closer look at this. I have a section of one of my chapters that focuses on this Telugu poet, Urum Joshua, who entered the Telugu literati during the early 20th century. And I draw your attention to Joshua because he really illustrates well this space of identity limbo of a Christian convert. Joshua became disillusioned with both the church and Hindu society. And he eventually adopted a space that he would describe as rationalism. That was the space that he wanted to inhabit. He became disillusioned with religion altogether. His most famous poem is Gabilam, which in Telugu is a reference to a bat, which is a bad omen. And the Gabilam becomes a metaphor for the plight of untouchable people. Gabilams hang around in temples, but untouchables are denied access to temples. And it's a very powerful poem that levels a rather trenchant critique of Brahminical culture and caste society in South India. In his biography, My Story, Joshua actually levels a rather trenchant critique of Christians, of a Christian society, that it's sometimes equally oppressive and equally discriminatory. So this is an example of someone who actually formulated at an intellectual, literary level this middle space that is occupied by these mass converts. They don't become completely Christian subjects right away. This middle space, this identity limbo, is even more evident in the stories that are told about mass converts in Punjab, especially among sanitation workers, the churas of the Punjab, and the chamars of the Punjab, who became Christian in mass movements. But prior to their conversion to Christianity, it was very difficult for anyone to tell what religion they belonged to. Some of them followed the traditions of local cult heroes like Ravi Das. Were they Valmikis? Were they Valmikis? Named after the author of the Ramayana. And so missionaries described the Churas as being almost chameleon-like in their ability to adapt to any religious context and to move back and forth between traditions. That identity complexity and that identity fluidity does not stop during the mass movements. They convert en masse to Christianity. But there's a study by Christopher Harding about the Capuchins and the London Mission Society, their work in Punjab among the Churas, and the real frustration that they experienced in trying to constitute them as proper Christian subjects. Missionaries would have much rather preferred to produce the Brahmin subject, the subjects of the centered Christianity of the earlier slide, that was the ideal, those were the trophies of grace, so to speak, that missionaries aspired for. But in terms of this trajectory, formerly Chura, now Christian, well, it wasn't that easy. It wasn't that easy to identify them as Churas. There is a missionary scholar who's also an Orientalist named Herbie DeWitt Griswold. He was a Presbyterian scholar who did some important ethnography on the Churas. And he made that observation that you don't really know if they've truly adopted Christianity. And one of the ways you can know is to look at their knowledge of Christian doctrine at the moment of baptism. And if it is sufficiently consolidated at the moment of baptism, you can administer the rite of communion. But communion is something that you have to save for the truly Christian, the true believer. So Griswold did a study of the gap that most of the different Christian denominations are instituting between the administration of baptism and the administration of communion to measure how readily people were admitting Christians into the Christian fold and counting them as Christians, considering them as bona fide believers. And he recommended something like a 6-month hiatus between the moment of baptism and the moment when they could take communion, because in 6 months you're gonna get a real Christian, a real believer. But this is the dilemma that missionaries were confronted with dealing with this class of people that were becoming Christian in a very large number. Very fascinating study, important study by Rupa Vishwanath called The Pariah Problem, which really identifies this relationship between landlords and laborers. And what happens when those laborers want to become Christian? Are they going to want to stop working in these servile conditions? Are they going to stop being, for all practical purposes, slaves of their landlords? This was the fear that landlords had, and it brought on a lot of violence toward converts, which is very well documented, not simply in the Tamil country, but in other parts of India as well. I believe you talked about these riots in West Bengal. So this moment of identity limbo is capitalized on by those who wish to oppose conversion. Because it's almost like it's straight from the horse's mouth, okay? If the missionary cannot tell if these are real Christians, those who are opposed to Christian conversion can use the language of inauthenticity, insincerity, to oppose the entire enterprise of converting. So this language of sincerity and authenticity it finds its origins in missionary discourse. Are they really Christian? Are they Christian in their heart, or are they only Christian in their outward practices? Opponents of missionaries seem to latch on to this idiom of sincerity and authenticity in order to discredit the enterprise. And so you have Gandhi saying things that are very similar about the untouchable converts in South India, that they really don't have the cognitive facilities to understand what they're doing when they become baptized. He sounds exactly like Griswold. Gandhi says they have paralyzed intellects. I mean, he starts saying very disparaging things about the decisions that Dalits were making to become Christian. Griswold also said very disparaging things. He said that the Chura converts are like infant baptism. It's like infant baptism. It's this infantilizing discourse. He was likening mass converts in India to infant baptism in Europe. Well, Gandhi's doing something very similar in basically discrediting conversions, because he said, well, these folks don't have the intellectual capacity to make an informed decision. Matter of fact, it's no different from baptizing by cow. Can a cow become a Christian? I mean, this is a very, intense moment that elicited a very fiery response from Ambedkar, basically saying, well, Gandhi's an ignoramus for drawing any kind of connection between a Dalit and a cow. But you would imagine that Gandhi and Griswold would have this moment of solidarity where they could give each other this big high five. You think that's false conversion? Well, I do too. I think it's false contrived conversion too. But Gandhi took the idiom of sincerity and authenticity and channeled it into an entirely different space. He channeled it into a space that says, it's impossible to convert. You don't really ever convert. Once a Hindu, always a Hindu, and the default setting of Dalits is Hindu. So if they appear to convert to another religion, by definition, it's an inducement. It's an inducement by missionaries who are dangling material inducements in front of them and luring them to baptism for some reason that's other than a spiritual, theological reason. And so Gandhi appears to be on the same page as the missionaries who doubted sincerity and authenticity, but he's taking it to a place that's a little bit farther, and it's anchored in this Indic argument that you remain fixed in the religion of your birth. And it's impossible. Any kind of change is contrived, and it's some sort of manipulation. So I'm going to transition now to from identity limbo to Dalit theology and this production that happens in the 1950s and 60s. And what becomes emphasized in some Dalit theology are the actual experiences of Dalits. The use of the centrality of the drum. This comes out in the work of a theologian named Satyanathan Clark. So drum beating is central to pariah experience. They beat the drum at funeral processions. They beat the drum to inform people that they're coming into these spaces. And so Sati Clark basically argues that the drum should be central to any sort of theological production of Dalits, as well as many other aspects of their folklore, of their imagination, of their local experiences. So Zoe Sherinian brings in music to her own understanding of how Dalit theology is actually produced. And other streams of Dalit theology draw a parallel between the brokenness of the Dalit body and the brokenness of Christ's body. Not unlike what is produced in some African American theology. The lynched African American body has a unique identification with the suffering Christ. And so Dalit Christian theology engages in a kind of decentering by producing more narrations of what Dalit experiences are like, what their ethnographic space is, which is different from Sanskritic caste society. And through that differentiating, channeling Kancha Eli's, why I'm not a Hindu, well, I've never had these Hindu practices. What are you talking about? Why are you calling me a Hindu? Because my practices are entirely different from Sanskritic cultural practices. So this is how the act of decentering happens in these domains when people begin to eventually speak up. So that takes us into Zoom again. Okay. The appropriation of Ambedkar by Dalit Christians. Dalit Christians, some of them say, well, we read Ambedkar in one hand, we read the Bible in the other hand. So it's Ambedkar and Jesus together. Jesus gives us our spirituality, Ambedkar our politics. And that becomes very central to many Dalit Christians, is their affinity for Ambedkar and his legacy of championing the legal and political rights of Dalits. The problem is that Dalits who did not become Christian appropriated Ambedkar and became neo-Buddhist. And they often don't see Dalit Christians as having the right to own Ambedkar because Dalit Christians enjoy a comparable higher level of mobility to non-Christian Dalits who have to leave that social space by becoming Buddhists. So you already have the benefits of access to missionary infrastructure. Why do you need Ambedkar? Why the need for this radical reformer? Why do you want to pollute his legacy by associating him with a religion that he himself chose not to embrace when he decided to become a Buddhist instead? So that is that moment of Dalit Christian identity formation. And as I was putting some of this together, I didn't put it in the book, I realized that these roughly correspond with Antonio Gramsci's stages of identity, where you have of the subaltern. The subaltern has no identity. The subaltern then forms a consciousness, and from that consciousness is able to engage in the type of political praxis around that identity. And so you do have something similar going on here with the trajectory that I'm describing. But things get a little complicated. Oh, what happened to my Pentecostalism slide? When we get to Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism is a form of Christianity that places a strong emphasis on the Holy Spirit, signified in the speaking of tongues. They call it the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And Pentecostalism emphasizes the role of the supernatural in everyday life, the centrality of not only speaking in tongues, but other miracles like physical healing, exorcism, prophetic utterances, ecstatic experiences. And so more and more Dalits are finding a sense of belonging and identity in Pentecostalism. But what happens to Dalitness when you become Pentecostalism? That is a great project for somebody in this room to take up, because I don't fully answer that in my book. But there is this emphasis on the crucified Christ in Dalit theology and the parallel between the broken Dalit body and the broken Christ body. But Pentecostalism also places a strong emphasis on the death of Christ, but it is in the framework of substitution. So Dalit theology says he died like us, he is crushed like us, but Pentecostalism says he died in our place, he died for us. So that suggests that there is a kind of effacing of Dalitness when one becomes a Pentecostal. And that there's an effacing, a subsuming of Dalit identity into a larger worldwide Pentecostal movement. And so you have this, this explosive growth of Pentecostalism in places like Nigeria, South Korea, many different Latin American countries, Brazil. That's an old story. I mean, Pentecostalism is just growing, and it's infringing upon the domains once controlled by Catholicism in Latin America. It's gotten to a point where Pentecostals have become very politicized, are wielding lots of influence in Latin America, getting involved in elections, throwing their weight behind dictatorships like Bolsonaro. So that is the trajectory in other parts of the global South, is this explosion of Pentecostal growth. You have rapid Pentecostal growth in India as well. You have, I think there are 16 million Pentecostals in India, and they represent 1/3 of the entire Christian population in India. But they also represent the fastest growth curve among all Christian groups. And this was a recent article in India Today, the pastors of the Punjab. And so you have doctors, engineers, businessmen, prominent businessmen in Punjab who are doubling as pastors and are starting churches, some of them getting very large. But the largest constituencies in these churches are people from the most backward communities in Punjab. But what they find in these spaces is the capacity to mix and mingle with people who are from more established middle classes and upper castes, which they didn't enjoy in the earlier mainline Christian denominational experiences, because they were Dalits there, but they sat next to other Mallas and Madigas and backward communities. But now in Pentecostal context, they are able to go to church and actually experience spiritual experiences like everyone else. And it's also a space that invites women to play very prominent roles, which is why so many of the images of Pentecostals feature women who are worshiping, women who are praying, because of the active agency that women enjoy in Pentecostal context to perform the works and the miracles of the church. You also have a culture of flamboyance and prosperity in Pentecostalism. So prosperity and prosperity gospel, prosperity preaching, the signs that you are a true devotee is that you begin to experience not only better health, but also better access to middle-class niceties. And so this becomes an important part of Pentecostalism in urban areas in India. And it's also a part of affective citizenship, because one aspect of affectivity is aspiration. The aspiration to become rich, the aspiration to experience mobility. So we can say, a Christian can be very critical of prosperity gospel, that it's manipulative, and it's getting people to take out subprime mortgages. That's a big explanation given to the housing crisis that Pentecostal preaching was telling people to take loans out that they could never repay, and it's the sign of true faith that you're going to buy that big house. Not going to work in Boston. Anyway, so Pentecostal affectivity encompasses this culture of flamboyance. So you do have these Pentecostal preachers that are living in these extraordinary homes, and you wonder, are they accessing global capital in these unique ways to afford a more luxuriant lifestyle than most of the Pentecostals who are from more backward communities. Pentecostalism also taps into worldwide networks of Christian broadcasting. There are several 24/7 Christian broadcasting networks in India that broadcast international Pentecostal preaching and programming. And so all of this is happening over the last several decades. It accompanies the rise of Hindutva in India. And it's almost like a perfect storm that you have people that are pushing for the establishment of a Hindu nation, just at a time when you have a segment of the Christian community that is rapidly growing demographically, and some of which is accessing these worldwide networks of programming and wealth. And so with this, you do have a spike in anti-Christian violence. From 64 to 96, according to a study by Chad Bowman, there were only 38 instances of anti-Christian violence that were documented. 1996, the year that the BJP forms its first coalition government, that number goes to 90 in 1 year. This is 38 over 30 years. 90 in 1 year, 200 over 4 years, and over 500 instances of anti-Christian violence in 2021-22 alone. And this can happen in terms of, somebody is giving a sermon, or people are worshiping in an emotionally expressive way, and their church can be a group of saffron-clad Hindutva activists will just barge into the church and beat up the pastor, violate women, and ransack the church. I mean, this stuff is happening rather routinely now. And in Bangalore last year, there were a number of instances of anti-Christian activity, including burning of Bibles, the ransacking of a Christian bookstore, attacks on churches and pastors, because it was a state where the BJP wanted to introduce an anti-conversion law. And they were almost priming the pump by engaging in this intimidation. It's a southern state, but it's also a state where the BJP tactically and strategically wants to gain a foothold. And so you have these acts of anti-Christian violence that accompany the push for anti-conversion legislation. And part of the argument against conversion is that it is premised on conversion by inducement. But what is inducement? In Gandhi's discourse, it was the offering of humanitarian aid and tangible material benefits for people that changed their religion because of the resources that are possessed by missionaries. But in the context of Pentecostalism, inducement can apply to affective goods. You made people feel good when they were dancing around in church. You made people feel like they were going to go to heaven for speaking in tongues. That is affective inducement. That is inducement, okay? So the very act of decentering by creating these other domains of affectivity and belonging are being encompassed by the logic of anti-conversion rhetoric. And that is creating, of course, dilemmas for the courts. I mean, how do you draw the line between an affective good and a material inducement? But that's the way the language of these laws is the ambiguity is built into them. Toward the tail end of 2021, around Christmas time, there was a burning of an effigy of Santa Claus in the streets of Agra. And a Hindutva activist named Ajit Chauhan basically said that a lot of people think Santa Claus is coming here to give gifts. That is not the case. Santa Claus is here to induce little kids to become Christian by offering them gifts. It was the same Ajit Chauhan who supported the lynching and murder of a Muslim man for engaging in so-called love jihad. So there is this interesting rhetoric of Hindu activism that conversion to Islam is the product of seducing, whereas conversion to Christianity is the product of inducing. And so Santa Claus, this chanting of Santa Claus Murdabad, down with Santa Claus, becomes this device for attacking Christian conversion. But there's something a little deeper at work in picking on Santa Claus. Because up until this point, there are acts of violence against Christians that relate to Dalit Christian communities who were marginal to political society. They were part of the Chinese political society. They were marginal to civil society to begin with. When you start picking on Santa Claus, you start saying, okay, now the middle class, moneyed class of Christians who can give gifts and be a part of this commercial neoliberal society, now these folks are vulnerable as well to this kind of vilification and this denial of citizenship. And so this is where I think Jason Keats Fernandez's work is quite important, that political society does not simply consist of people that are economically marginalized from real citizenship. It also consists of people who are marginalized on a cultural basis, and on the basis of other forms of identity. So I'm going to stop there. I have other conclusions about decentering and conversion, but I think that's a good place to stop.